that. All right, well, welcome back. I'd like to do a really quick reference back to the session that we had last week. And doing that, I'm going to put my PowerPoint up. And I'm going to move this here so I can do this. There we go.
I'm sorry, Reverend Jim. I'm hearing a tapping sound in the background. Okay.
That's me on my computer while I'm changing stuff, while I'm putting the screen up. I think
okay. All right. Thank you.
That'll probably end shortly as soon as I'm done tapping. Down here. Okay, here we go. So last week we discussed the early Greek philosophers, and I just wanted to remind you of a few ideas that were part of that discussion. The first point, things that appear are made from things that do not appear. That was the whole idea of what is everything made of, right? And what all these philosophers concluded, and this is still an idea I think that we share today, is that the surface of things that we experience with our senses does not get to the bottom of things, so to speak. That the appearances, what appears to us, is made up of something deeper than what appears. So just what that something is, there are various opinions about, right? So there are those who believe that the universe is made up of atoms or fields, the physical fields and that sort of thing. There are others that believe that the ultimate nature of the universe is mind or spirit, and those two ideas were present in the philosophies of the ancient Greeks, and they're still very much present with us today, different people holding to these different opinions. We remember that Jesus said, judge not by appearances, but judge right judgment. Turns out that's a lot easier said than done. How do we get to the bottom of things? And so this is a pursuit of knowledge, and one of the things we learned from the ancient Greeks, especially from Socrates, is that, and well, even from Thales, the earliest philosopher, true knowledge begins with asking questions and questioning the answers. So we aren't satisfied once we ask a question with the first thought that pops into our head, but we examine it, we think about it, reflect on it, we challenge it, then we see if it doesn't hold up, we try another idea. That's the Socratic dialectic, if you will, right? Getting knowledge in that way. It's not the only way to gain knowledge, but it is a way. And it's important to remember that opinions are not knowledge. It's not knowledge until we can in some way verify the idea, whether we verify it experientially or logically. There's got to be some way that we can say, okay, we know this to be true because the evidence shows it, or because logically just to this point, but whatever it is. So we need to question, okay, including any insights that we might gain from these philosophers. We question those as well. So I guess what I want to say is that what you get from this course isn't so not much necessarily understanding what the different philosophers said, but what you get from that, what your response to it is. That's where you make the valuable discoveries. Does this insight make sense to me? Is it something that is real for me? Is it something that I can apply in my life? Okay. Another idea we get from the ancient Greeks is that there's such a thing as intuitive knowledge, a sort of a knowledge of the soul. At any rate, that was the belief of Socrates and Plato. Now, how do we get at this knowledge? Well, the way they got at it was by that process of questioning, but also by a process of personal contemplation. To, for example, in order to discover the idea of the good or the beautiful, we can contemplate those ideas as we understand them, starting with our sort of the level of perception, and then moving ever inward and out and into broader perspective. So we might know what beauty means to us on the surface of things, our response to the beauty of a person or nature. But Socrates said that's not the place to stop. What's more important is whatever a beautiful soul is. So then we try to think of what a beautiful soul is, and then gradually rise up from beautiful soul to what is beauty itself, the divine idea, if you will. Of course, in Unity, we talk about divine ideas as the foundation of the universe. And in that, we are very much in the larger tradition of Socrates and Plato. But another element of knowing is from the observation of nature. Okay, and that's an idea that was more important to, it was important to Plato, but it was even more important to Aristotle, who tended to, while Plato tended to think of what we can observe as being an imitation of the real being the divine ideas, Aristotle thought that that nature was just as real as anything, and that what Plato called the divine ideas were actually just names or categories that we create to describe what we observe in nature. So those, again, two sort of ways of looking at the universe that lead to somewhat different results. And in a sense, throughout the history of philosophy, throughout the history of thought, these two camps are continually sort of arguing with each other, even to today, is what's more fundamental, some kind of eternal ideas or nature? What's more fundamental, matter or mind? And of course, some have thought, well, they're both real. They just have different functions and that sort of thing. So we'll see the interplay of that as we go through this. And again, if I go back to unity metaphysics, we think of nature in effect as a manifestation of mind, as a manifestation of divine ideas. And we also think of ourselves as participating in that process. The ideas we hold impact the manifest world, as we call it. And finally, another important point is the role of logic. What logic can do, and sort of the great contributor to this is Aristotle and his influence through the ages, is the idea of formal logic. There is a way of telling the difference between a good argument and a bad argument just based on the form of the argument. And this logic helps us sort out inferences that we might make when we make observations in nature, or even when we are trying to define something. We can use logic. An example of an argument that is an invalid argument because it doesn't have the proper logical form is all cows are animals, all humans are animals, therefore all cows are humans. Well, this is a false argument because it has the wrong logical form. Okay, so a correct argument might be using the same sort of thing. All cows are animals. Daisy is a cow, giving a name for a cow, and then therefore Daisy is an animal. See, so that has a correct logical form. So there are such things as false arguments and valid arguments, or invalid and valid arguments, and those help us sort things out as well. In order for an argument to be completely true in a deductive way, the premises have to be true as well as the logical form, obviously. But if the logical form is off, then the argument's off. So I'm a great believer in learning about logic, just because it helps you. One of the things it helps you do as a citizen is sort through political rhetoric. What I have found is that political pundits and politicians often make statements that sound good, but when you look at the logic of it, the form of the argument is invalid. So that's like one life application, I guess you could say. And in the quest for truth, it's also something to be aware of when someone is making a valid argument and when they are making a false argument. Their conclusion could still be true, which is the weird thing about logic. The conclusion could still be true, but it's not proven true by the argument. It has to have some other way of getting at it in a logical way. Okay, so we won't be doing a lot of the logic part of this, but it's just something that we, as I said, insights that we've gained. Okay, come on. All right, maybe I have to click on this. Oh, there we go. Okay, I had to click on my PowerPoint to move to the next slide. Okay, so we thought about these questions a little bit last week. I'm going to skip over that and go into this week's topic, still continuing to look at the philosophers, but now we're going to look at a sort of key idea in philosophy that has maybe the ultimate practical value for us as individuals, and that is the idea of happiness, right? The pursuit of happiness, as we say. And the Greeks had a word for that, what they were seeking, and this is true of especially starting with Socrates and then moving forward, Plato, Aristotle, and the others, is, what is the happy life? And the word they used actually was eudaimonia. It's a Greek word that's a combination of the words good and spirit. And so most of the time when that word shows up in a Greek text, it's translated as happiness, but it actually has a number of other meanings, related meanings, obviously, and you can kind of tell what the meaning is based on the context. But some of the other meanings are the ability to live well and virtuously. Okay, sometimes the idea of living virtuously is a part of what one of the philosophers means by a happy life. Simply flourishing, to flourish as an individual. It can just mean prosperity, is our favorite unity word, prosperity, one of our favorites, or blessedness. So the word has a much broader meaning than just happiness, as you can see. And one of the things that Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then all subsequent philosophers were concerned with is, okay, how do we get there? They want to know what the good is, and they also want to know, in practical terms, what's the good life? And so that's actually at the root of the discipline of ethics, of thinking about morality, thinking about ethics, was originally the idea of how do we live a happy life. And this question is related to metaphysics in that our beliefs about reality would influence our ideas about how to achieve this prosperity or ability to live well, or to this idea of happiness. I'll give you a real simple and I think a pretty straightforward and clear example of what I'm talking about as how metaphysics is related. If one held to the position that the universe is entirely material, so that what we call and experience as mind, what we call mind and experience as mind, is really just and only a product of the brain and the nervous system functioning in an interaction with the material universe. Okay, so suppose we take that as our metaphysical position. One of the things that implies is that, as they say, when you're dead, you're dead. There's no afterlife in a world that's purely material or physical. Consciousness is gone when the brain is no longer functioning. Very simple as possible terms. And so what that means in terms of your practical life, what we call moral choices or any kind of choices, what it means is that there are no afterlife rewards, there are no afterlife consequences of your behavior or of your beliefs. There are only the here and now present life consequences. And if one takes that position, their calculations about morality and what's the best way to live and those sorts of things, their calculations are different from those who believe that there's an afterlife and those who think that their actions and beliefs do have consequences. Because when you start thinking of afterlife consequences, and you're thinking, well, I want to have the best possible afterlife as well, so I need to do in this life what will get me into heaven, to put it in simplest terms. So as soon as you change the metaphysic from a materialist metaphysic to a spiritual one, or maybe one of mind and matter, as it were, and you start talking about whether or not there's an afterlife, that enters into our calculations, or that can enter into our calculations about how to live and what choices to make, right? So that's a really simple example of how metaphysics is related to happy life. And of course, in unity, we recognize that we believe, as a matter, I hope, to a great extent of experience, we believe the kinds of thoughts that we hold and the beliefs we establish in our consciousness affect our lives and can even affect things like our health and our relative prosperity, right? Because we see the universe as fundamentally and at root mind. And so what we do with our minds is one of the most important things that we have. in that metaphysic. If you had another metaphysic where you didn't think mind affected anything at all in any sort of direct or indirect way, you would have a different idea about how what difference it makes how you think, right? How you feel. So there's all kinds of things that can factor into this metaphysics. So I'm going to stop and take a second and see if anyone has any questions or comments on before we start digging into a few more ideas about this topic. And if you do, if you can, let me see. I guess just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up. No one's speaking, so let's go ahead. Okay, so this idea of achieving happiness, starting with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, part of their idea of being happy or attaining happiness was to live virtuously. Socrates and Plato were especially strong on this point, arguing that, for example, one of the things Socrates argued was that it's better to be the victim of a wrong than be the perpetrator of a wrong. Okay? So he made an argument that it's happier to be, for example, unjustly punished than to be the person who inflicts the injustice. And I won't go into what his whole argument now, but the kind of the upshot of it was, it's better that justice and good prevail. And so if you participate in injustice, then you are doing a wrong that cannot possibly bring you happiness, whereas a person who is a victim of injustice can still find happiness because, assuming that they are in fact on the that they are virtuous, right? That's kind of the idea. So whether or not you agree with that, this is kind of position they took, and for Plato there were four fundamental, what they call cardinal virtues, things that the soul seeks to attain in order to achieve a happy life. So one of them is justness. Another one is temperance, which is sort of the idea of living a life of moderation, including an ability to have self-control, to not have your anger, for example, carry you away. So justice, being just, temperance, courage, prudence, which is kind of basically the idea of having the wisdom to make good judgments in your life, to make judgments that benefit you. So prudence, those are the four cardinal virtues. Sometimes the idea of piety or devotion is also considered to be a Platonic virtue. And then Aristotle added a whole bunch of them. I don't actually have the whole list here, but it gives you an idea. Patience, he added patience, magnanimity, liberality, friendliness, wittiness. It's interesting. Gentleness, modesty, and truthfulness. So they arrived at they arrived at somewhat different ideas about what these virtues are and how to attain them. Aristotle and Plato, we'll use those as the two examples. For Plato, and in order to attain these virtues, we have to contemplate the ideas until we actually know what they are, that we can have a sort of direct experience. So when we were doing a meditation on joy, each one of you did your best to be open to what that meant to you and how you experienced it, no matter how you describe it. So what we're doing in the meditation was seeking an intuitive sense, if you will, a soul's remembrance of joy. That's the Platonic approach, right? Aristotle would go thinking in a different way. He would go, okay, so what is joy? And he would look at, in order to find joy, we have to think of deficiencies of joy and what that is, and excess of joy and what that is, and then find the middle ground, finding the golden mean, so to speak. So he tried to do it with statements, logical sorts of statements, rather than to define it, rather than having an intuitive knowing of what it is. So two different approaches to the idea of what virtue is, but Aristotle and Plato both agreed that in order to attain happiness, virtue has to be at least a part of that picture. And I'll stop for a second, see if anyone has anything to say about one way or another about whether you think that virtue is sort of at the core of finding happiness or finding blessedness. What you might have to say for or against that, regardless of how at the moment you define virtue. Does anybody want to say agree or disagree for any particular reason as you think about it now? Maya, I see you waving.
I was wondering, did any of this thinking creep into the Roman Catholic present teaching?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. We haven't really got to that yet, but Aristotle.
Oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's okay. No, it's a legitimate question. As we'll see, the earliest Christians were most influenced by Plato's views, and then in the Middle Ages, Christians were most affected by Aristotle's views, and in the Middle Ages and to this day, in fact, right? So Catholic ethics is a kind of Christian moderation of Aristotelian ethics. So absolutely. So the Christian virtues might be sorted out a little bit differently than the way Plato and Aristotle did, but still that idea is very much a part of that, yeah, that whole worldview. So this is actually a very good question. Thank you. I see Wilma's hand up. Go ahead, Wilma. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I was, as I was sort of jotting down those points, it reminded me of, I can't remember what book in the Bible it is, where it talks about the fruits of the Spirit.
Yes. Yes, yeah, that's Paul and yeah, no, I don't remember which letter it was, but I know what you're talking about, right? And yeah, the fruits of the Spirit basically were Paul's sort of delineation of what, Christian virtues, if you will.
Yes.
And yeah, and no doubt.
Then I remember years ago when we had a group from the Unity in Scarborough, Ontario. They came to visit us in Montreal, and we had a conversation about that. And we were encouraged to choose one fruit every day. Like you'd have a bowl of fruits and you may say, I'm taking a banana to work today. Instead of the fruits of the Spirit would be gentleness and peace and love. And you choose one of those as your fruit for the day. And I thought, I have always remembered that and try to do it even until now.
Yeah, I like that. Sort of a fruit salad of spiritual virtues, right? Because
yes.
sure, Paul and the other Christians believed that when they received the Holy Spirit, in doing so, the Holy Spirit transformed them and gave them these gifts, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and for me, whatever I'm learning, it's about improving myself. It's not just about having the knowledge, but using it to improve myself. Yeah. So I was thinking about all that as you were talking about the Greek virtues.
Yeah, that's a very good insight. Yeah, nice connection with the Bible there too, Wilma. Yeah. There's Paul. We haven't got to the Stoics yet, but Paul was familiar to some degree with Stoic philosophy. We know this from some of the things he said, but especially his use of the word conscience, which seems like so what he used the word conscience. Well, conscience was a technical Stoic term, the idea of knowing things by conscience, sort of the idea of having intuition of an intuition of the divine ideas, if we can go back into those terms. So Paul used that word, which indicates that he knew something about that, among other things, indicates that he knew something about Stoic philosophy. He was a person who was very familiar with a variety of aspects of his culture, right? But anyway, yeah, that passage will be an example of, especially when we think that receiving the Spirit is also supposed to be something that brings you joy, right? And I don't remember if joy was one of Paul's fruits of the Spirit or not, but yes. I'm embarrassed to admit I don't have that memorized, so I'll have to go back and look it up. But in any case, that's the Greek view. And I think what's interesting about, one of the things that's interesting to me about this in a modern context is I don't think most people today even think about any sort of connection between, really a connection between being virtuous, however you define that, and being happy or being prosperous. I don't think we don't tend to frame things that way anymore, even though people have ideas about what both of those terms mean. So it's sort of interesting that for the Greeks, you couldn't really, at least for these philosophers, you couldn't really attain happiness, blessedness. You couldn't really flourish unless you first sort of cultivated these virtues, knew what they were, and then lived by them. So, was there anything else before I go ahead? So, what happened is what historians sometimes call the Socratic movement. So people interpreted Socrates and his life in different ways, and then also attempted to assimilate in some way some of Aristotle's ideas. And so these were the major groups, and these of the what we call the Socratic movement. These different philosophies emerged. You can see the time frames there, and they all were really centered on that idea of eudaimonia, the good spirit, the living virtuously, if I can continue to use that word, living the good life, right? So all of them are really about that, and how do you do that? And some were they were all strongly influenced by Socrates, but they were in some cases influenced more by his lifestyle than anything that he actually taught. And so they arrived at sort of different ideas about what it meant. So the first group you see on there is were the Cynics. And what we think of as a cynic today is not really the same thing as a cynic was then. The Cynics were, I guess you could say, cynical about human conventions, conforming to social artifices. They basically rejected a lot of the values of their era, but that does not mean they were cynical in a modern sense. The Cynics not only believed in God, but they also believed that they were offspring of God. And the Cynics, if I can sort of characterize them by their uniform, the Cynics always had an extra cloak that they walked around with, which they said represented their robe as royalty. They had a staff, which was, for purposes of personal protection, certainly, but they also thought of it as their scepter, right? And then they had a purse, which they said carried all their provisions, a purse or wallet, or what you want to call it. And so they would walk around, and those were their only possessions. So in a way, they had kind of a little uniform that made them recognizable. When you saw a guy walking around with the extra cloak, the staff, and the purse, and nothing else, then you knew you were having an encounter with one of these traveling philosophers, the Cynics. And they were imitating, as they saw it, the life of Socrates. The first Cynic, or the person who's thought of really as the originator of this philosophy, was an actual student of Socrates named Antisthenes. And then maybe the most famous Cynic was Diogenes. You've probably all heard of Diogenes. The picture that you see on the slide here is a portrayal of an event in Diogenes' life. It sort of gets at the Cynic's values. The man standing there in the military uniform is supposed to be Alexander the Great conqueror, the great emperor, if you will, the first Greek great emperor, right? And the man sitting on the ground, you see he's got a staff in his left hand there, and he's got his hand held out. This is a depiction of this story of an encounter between Diogenes and Alexander the Great. And according to the story, Alexander the Great had heard of the wisdom of Diogenes, and so he decided he wanted to go visit Diogenes and give him a reward. And so he came to him and he said, I can give you anything you want, even a kingdom if you want, because of your wisdom. And so ask me any favor and I will give it to you. And Diogenes replied, just now you're standing in my sun, please move aside. Diogenes was sunning. He was getting himself, he was just sort of basking in the sun, getting a little sun, getting a little tan. And according to the story, Alexander the Great was creating a shadow that was blocking his sun. So all that Diogenes asked for was for Alexander to get out of the way, because he didn't want anything else. It was a point of pride for the Cynics that their happiness consisted in their absolute freedom from any human obligations. They didn't owe anybody anything. They were not burdened by possessions. They thought of all possessions, including houses and those sorts of things. They thought of those as burdens, right? So they were free of all that. And that's why they thought of themselves as being the most godlike, because they didn't need anything. They didn't need anything from anyone. So you might ask, well, how did the Cynics survive then? Well, they went around preaching their philosophy in a fairly entertaining way, because basically what a part of their approach was to make fun of the kinds of things that human beings worry about, right? And the artificialities. And so they were humorous. They told little stories to make their points. People found them funny. They were sort of like, I guess, street stand-up comics in a sense, as well as being philosophers. And so when they would go out and proclaim their truth, and however they did it, people would give them money and bread, and that's of course what they used their purses for, to carry around their whatever they received for their preaching. They didn't owe anybody anything. They felt people owed them, because the Cynics were going around revealing the truth to people and the way to freedom. And the Cynics practiced we would call non-violent resistance. If anyone attacked them, which people sometimes did, they refused to strike back. They simply took the blows, because I forget exactly what their justification for it was, but so they practiced nonviolent resistance. They believed that they were sons of God. They traveled very light, and they went around preaching and trying to illuminate people, and they taught in parables. So does any of that sound vaguely familiar to any of you? Does it sound like anyone you've heard of before?
Yeah, the apostles.
Yeah, the apostles, right. In
Mhm.
fact, if you read Jesus's instructions to his disciples when he sent them out, he actually tried to do the Cynics one better. He told them not to carry a purse, and not to carry a staff, and not to take an extra cloak. It was like, you guys think you're travel light? Wait till you see my guys, right? So, I shouldn't say guys, because actually there were women Cynics, and there were also women disciples, which has sort of been covered up in history by focusing on like the 12 male disciples. But from what we can tell from earliest historic records, there were in fact women who would travel around preaching. Usually it was in couples, right? Male and female, or at least I shouldn't say that's proven, but that's a definite possibility from what we know. But we know that there were Cynic philosophers who were women. And so some biblical scholars think that Jesus was a kind of Jewish Cynic, because in a lot of ways he had a lot of things in common with them. So that's why I put his name up there. The Cynic movement had great popularity in the era that Jesus lived in. They were all over the world. So it's very likely that he would have encountered him, especially in some of the Greek-influenced cities that he traveled to. And in fact, the Cynic movement lasted, what was actually fairly hardy, I guess you could say, for about 600 years. So well past the Christian era, the Cynics were a popular philosophy. So I'm very fascinated by them. It was a very interesting group. But in terms of, well, what brings happiness then? Happiness is fundamentally this freedom that they had, always being provided for, but not actually having to own anything, not being burdened by possessions, and so on. So they're kind of, today we would say they were homeless. And we're sometimes abused in a way that homeless people are sometimes abused by people who, for some reason, were angered by them. But it's a fascinating philosophy, a very extreme sort of lifestyle. I admit that as much as I admire that, I wouldn't want to live that way. For one thing, I'd have to give up all my books, which would be just a terrible tragedy. You see some of them behind me here. They're all over. Yeah, so I would not make a very good cynic, but I understand kind of what their position is, because anyone who's a householder, anyone who owns a home, know that there's a lot of obligations and that sort of thing that go with that. Taxes, utilities, all that sort of thing. The cynics didn't have any of that stuff. So for what it's worth, right? So anyway, that was one school, one idea of this happiness fundamentally as freedom, right? In a very extreme sort of way of freedom. A second school were the skeptics. Now, what the skeptics got from Socrates, and their founder was PHILO. You might have heard the word Pyrrhonic. That comes from Pyrrho. What they got from Socrates was this idea of questioning other people's answers. The skeptics took it to an extreme. They concluded from Socrates' encounters, especially, I suppose, as portrayed by Plato, but also just as was well known at the time, they concluded that there were no answers, right? You can argue about this all you want, but one opinion is as good as another. So that's what a skeptic was. So the skeptics basically didn't think that there was any possibility of arriving at what the truth was. And so the way to lead a happy life was simply to do what was most pleasant and convenient for you, right? So the ideas of virtues and that sort of thing really didn't make any difference to the skeptics. They would conform to social norms simply because it was convenient, not necessarily because they believed in it. It was a way to get along in the world, to grease the wheels, so to speak. Go along to get along, that sort of thing. So that's what the skeptics held, and of course, and I guess you could say the skeptics had no metaphysics, or they simply believed that it was impossible to arrive at a true understanding of the nature of the universe. So we might as well just live our lives in the most pleasant way possible. So that's what a skeptic was, and that's what they got from Socrates. There is no truth. So that's another extreme sort of position that came out of this. It wasn't a very large movement in the way that the cynics were, but it had some influence. If only it continued this sort of idea that Socrates had of challenging other people's, challenging the various answers that people come up with. The difference between a skeptic and Socrates is Socrates believed sooner or later you could arrive at truth by this method. The skeptics believe, no, you can't. Anything can be disputed. So anyway, that's the skeptics. We still have skeptics today, of course. People who live for, primarily, I suppose, from what we might call the perspective of self-interest. How can I best get along in the world? There are no real virtues. There's only sort of life, right? So that's the skeptic. Another group that's very much misunderstood in the same way the cynics were the Epicureans. The Epicureans basically concluded that the two fundamental experiences in human life are pleasure and pain. And so in order to lead the happiest life, you want to minimize, if not eliminate, all pain and maximize pleasure, right? So we have the idea of an Epicurean today as someone who is a connoisseur of fine foods and wine and that sort of thing. And that's not the way the early Epicureans were, because Epicurus, his philosophy was that in order to minimize pain, one of the things that you have to do is eat as simple of foods as possible. He believed that various delicacies and rich foods gave a person indigestion and was not good for the health. And so, I think he was probably a vegan, or at least a vegetarian in his lifestyle. And so he thought, the main thing is to avoid pain, to not do things that are going to cause you pain. And so he also did not believe in the accumulation of wealth, because like the cynics, he thought wealth and luxury were actually burdens things that burdened us rather than things that liberated us. So the Epicureans, in a sense, were more like the Cynics than what we think of today as an Epicurean, right? So that's another, another approach to happiness. There's actually a lot of focus on health in this approach, right? To do what keeps you healthy, because that's what maximizes your pleasure. Somebody have a question, comment? Oh, I heard noise in the background. I thought somebody had something they wanted to ask about. So the last group are the Stoics, and the Stoics kind of looked at the Cynics and said, they've got a really good point here about how we are burdened by the things that we are attached to. On the other hand, they didn't really think it was necessary to live the extreme lifestyle of the Cynics. They believe that one, what we might say today, one ought to do what one is called to do. So if it happens that you are called to be in politics or in business, and that's what your life is, and whatever kind of wealth you might accumulate is fine, as long as you're not attached to it. So they shifted it from this sort of extreme elimination of physical possessions to an emotional non-attachment to possessions, or not just to possessions, but to conditions or events in life. The Stoics prided themselves on not being disturbed by unfortunate events. They generally believed in a sort of a deterministic universe. Whatever happens, happens. There's nothing you can do about it. So there's no sense worrying about it or getting upset by it. You just simply accept it and move on. So that's sort of the idea of the Stoic approach. Just sort of, whatever comes up is going to come up, and you just deal with it as best you can, and try to live a virtuous life. They believe that the best way to live is to, as much as possible, live in harmony with nature, right? Because everything is sort of determined, and to be ambitious is generally to be disappointed, and therefore to suffer, in a sense, right? Because no matter what, it's very difficult to satisfy ambition. What tends to happen with people who are ambitious, they achieve certain goals, but there's never an end to their goals. Okay, now I've done this. Now I have to, now I have to earn more money. Now I have to become more famous. Now I have to become more powerful, whatever it is. So that ambition tends to drive a person beyond extremes. One of the interesting things about this, too, by the way, is one of the most famous Stoics was a Roman emperor named Marcus Aurelius. So he sort of had the highest possible power and wealth that one could have or one could imagine in the world, and yet he was a Stoic. His goal was to not be attached to any of that, to simply accept conditions as they were and to do what was his to do in that day. So that's sort of the Stoic position on happiness, right? Okay, so let's see how we doing here. Go ahead. So I'm going to come back to the whole idea of happiness and some of these conclusions, but I wanted to move ahead a little bit just to sort of show you, okay, where's the stream of thought go? One of the sort of the main metaphysical issues is what we call nature, what we observe or experience with our senses. The question is, what do we make of that in terms of its relationship to our understanding of what is reality? So for the Platonists, what we experience with our senses is just a shadow. Remember the men in the cave. This is a shadow of the real, and that you have to ascend the heights of, if I could put it this way, ascend the heights of consciousness in order to experience the real. We must go, rather than looking outward, in a sense, we must look inward to the realm of ideas, right? And so that's a Platonic view, which tends to sort of discount the natural world. The Aristotelian view, in a sense, is the opposite of that. it holds that nature is what we learn from. It's what we get our ideas from, our understandings of truth. So nature is very fundamental. Observation is very fundamental to knowing what the truth is. So the followers, in the spirit of Aristotle, tend to be materialists or physicalists, and the followers of the Platonic strand tend to be idealists. In other words, saying that the real is the ideal realm, right? So the supernatural is real for the Platonists, whereas the natural is more real in effect for those who come out of the stream of Aristotle. But that doesn't mean that everyone who followed Aristotle dismissed the idea of spiritual realities, because they didn't really concern themselves with whatever kind of contradiction there might be between holding that nature is real and holding that spirit is real or soul is real. In fact, that's what Aristotle himself held, that there is soul and there is body, there is soul, there is matter, there's soul in nature, and there's even spirit. And these are all real, I guess you could say, but maybe different dimensions of reality. So, but in any case, the followers of Aristotle tend to, gravitate towards studying nature and observation, that sort of thing. So what happens, okay, in Christian thought, this came up a little earlier, is that subsequent philosophers tended to be either Platonic or Aristotelian, right? And so we're going to look at some of these. Philo Judaeus was a Jewish philosopher, lived in Alexandria, Egypt. Plotinus, Origen, St. Augustine of Hippo, and John the Scot are some people I want to look at some of their ideas in the Platonic strand. And then kind of notice something interesting here. All the great Platonist thinkers are sort of earlier, and then the Aristotelian thinkers are later. So if you look at the ones that are primarily Aristotle and you look at their dates, you see they're all sort of after the Platonists. So you might wonder, well, how in the world did that happen? What happened that made that shift? And there's actually a fairly simple explanation of it. In between John the Scot and Peter Abelard over there were the Crusades. And in the Crusades, as you'll recall from your history books, the Christians fought the Muslims. And what happened was that there were Islamic or Muslim philosophers who made a study of Aristotle in the sort of European world, if you will. They mostly studied Plato. They had ignored Aristotle for many years, right? And so what happened was there was interchange of culture in the midst of these wars, and the intellectuals in the West got reacquainted with Aristotle by way of the Arab and the Muslim philosophers. So Avicenna up there, the first one up there, was a Muslim philosopher who was widely read then by the intellectuals in the West, and so they were influenced by that, and so they brought Aristotelianism back into the stream of Western thought, and one of the consequences of that was a greater interest in what we today think of as science, sort of the study of nature. It doesn't happen all at once, but this is a sort of a shift in consciousness. It's not that the later philosophers dismissed Plato. More often what they tried to do is find a way to reconcile Plato and Aristotle. So the philosophies were complex enough that they could sometimes find ways to make it look like Plato and Aristotle agreed, and in some respects they did. But they were, again, more influenced by Aristotle. And Maya, this is why Catholics tend to be Aristotelian, as I said, because Thomas Aquinas became the great philosopher of Catholic thought anyway, developer of Catholic theology and dogmas, but also various theological ideas. He becomes sort of the Christian Aristotle, if you will, and that remained through at least into the Renaissance era, when there was again another resurgence of Platonic thinkers.
But
So
unity,
the way
unity,
that shifted, yeah.
unity has definitely a Platonic, this whole thing about idea and divine mind, and
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, New Thought, Unity, Christian Science.
Yeah.
The Transcendentalists were more Platonic than Aristotelian, and that's
okay.
Yeah. So there was, as I said, there was kind of a revival in the Renaissance and then later years of Platonism. The Middle Ages sort of became, the late Middle Ages, I guess you'd say, were more influenced by Aristotle. So both philosophers continue to be influential in spirit, and at least among professional philosophers, they still have some interest in the various things that philosophers tend to be interested in. So you still see people reading and rereading those two philosophers as well as others. So what you get from that, I suppose from this shift, is that the earlier Christians tend to be more mystical, and the later Christians tend to be more intellectual, more focused on things like logic and science. So their ideas of happiness then would shift from a more Platonic approach of experiencing the divine ideas, right? And it would shift, and the virtuous and happiness then also adds to that sort of the ideas from the New Testament. So the Christian, what happens here is that the New Testament becomes is more and more interpreted in terms of philosophical ideas, either from Plato or from Aristotle. The Platonists tend to read the Bible allegorically or metaphorically, or as we say, metaphysically, right? And the followers of Aristotle tend to be more literal. They want to take the Bible as much as possible as consisting of facts and truths at the sort of basic level. So that's another thing that happens. Yeah, Maya?
I don't want to be the only one who asks you the question. Can you say something about free will? In what way did determination, predetermination, and free will flow through these two groups?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think that as I said, the Stoics were held to a deterministic view of the universe, and so they didn't really believe they actually have free will other than how you respond to things. So, in other words, your internal life, you can choose to be non-attached, you can choose to be undisturbed, you can choose to control your emotions, but you can't really change anything external. But I think that Plato and Aristotle both tended to sort of assume that humans have free will and therefore have choices to make, and therefore, looking for how do we make good choices? It's not that they said we could control everything, but that we do in fact have freedom regarding how we think and how we act in life and that sort of thing. Whereas Stoics sort of denied that. And determinism in Christianity sort of, as far as people not having free will, I think that really comes out of Augustine of Hippo's philosophy. I haven't got to Augustine yet, but jumping ahead a little bit, one of the things that he contended was that human beings cannot do good works without first having received grace. And so we don't truly have free will until we receive grace, right? Or become a Christian in effect. So that was Augustine's view. And then what happened in the Reformation era was that especially people like Calvin sort of took that idea to the extreme, and Luther actually too. The omnipotence of God, they interpret it as meaning God controls everything. And so if God controls everything, then that means God also controls human will. So we can have the illusion of free will, but we don't actually have it. So that was kind of an initial place where the Protestants staked themselves out, whereas their contemporaries in Catholicism continued to hold to an idea of free will, but they held to the Augustinian view of free will. You can't do good works unless you've been saved, unless you've received grace. You're one of the chosen.
Yeah.
So sort of weird, but after the Reformation age, the argument about whether or not we have free will goes on and on. I believe I've solved that problem, at least for myself, but you know, intellectually, right? But yeah, it's a good question, because it's sort of an ongoing argument that doesn't even come into play until Augustine. I think everybody sort of before Augustine just assumed that we have free will, that we have choice. Augustine sort of introduced this weird theological notion that you can't do good unless you can't truly do good of your own free will unless you've received the grace of God. That sort of confused things. And one of the things they were struggling with intellectually was, if God is omniscient, then doesn't that mean that God knows what we're going to do before we do it? And if God already knows it, then it's predetermined, they conclude, and therefore we don't actually have freedom to act. We're sort of, in a sense, acting out the script, as it were. So that's a thing that they struggled with. And I don't know if I want to go into my answer, but I haven't answered it. Maybe not yet, anyways. Were there any other thoughts or questions? We get kind of close. We're actually at
Lisa has her hand up.
What's that?
I saw Lisa had her hand up.
Oh, okay. I can't see everybody's picture, so I don't know who has their hand up.
Lisa.
Yep, my question is, at the turn
you.
of the first millennium, then we have the Platonic influence, and then at the turn of the second, we have the Aristotelian. What do we have now at the turn of the third millennium?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, again, this sort of jumping ahead of the story, so we'll come back to it. But what I've read and I've done a little research on what physicists are saying these days, and more physicists are saying, you know what, the universe seems to be more a matter of consciousness than a matter of matter, if you will. And that would be very much on the Platonic side of things. That's physicists. The weird thing that I discovered as a philosophy student was that most of my professors were actually more physicalists, materialists, if you will. So it's odd. The reason I think it's odd is it's a kind of another reversal, because back in the day, a philosopher would be more likely to be an idealist, a scientist would be a materialist or a physicalist, and now it's starting to flip, especially in the realms of physics and quantum physics. Those folks are seeing, you know what, mind is more fundamental, right? And maybe that everything is, in a sense, everything is mind stuff, as some of them have said. And so that's something that's a viewpoint that started in the 20th century among physicists. They're still idealist philosophers, but I don't make it sound like they're all materialists. But it's sort of interesting that I saw that weird kind of dichotomy. So I guess we're turning Platonic again, or I guess if we look at those two categories, and I don't know if that means at the next millennium we'll turn physicalist and Aristotelian again or not. I don't know. I'm not going to make any predictions in that area, but that's sort of what it looks like. It was a really good question. My answer is I don't know, but my best guess is what I said. Were there other questions? You have to speak up, or yes, you have to unmute yourself and speak up. You can then raise your hand too if you want to, but in order for me to see you on I only can see like 4 people here, and one of them's me. Let me just look to. I don't want to skip over these folks here to get to sort of stay on track. I'll compact stuff later. I didn't get as far as I thought I would, but as you see, what we'll go to next, we're going to look at PHILO and ORIGEN, and then some of these other philosophers that you saw on the previous slide here. So we're going to look at most of these folks coming up, and I hope actually even to get farther than that. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so any final questions or comments? Oh, you know what I did want to do though? Okay, I do want to jump ahead to one thing. So just as a sort of a little bit of discussion, if we can stretch this just a little bit longer, a little bit of discussion is, okay, now we see all of the the different ideas of how do you attain happiness, or what's the happy life, and I've sort of outlined them roughly here. Living virtuously, living according to the virtues, actualizing one's potential, okay, or flourishing as a human, Aristotle, not being attached, being unobligated, being free, the Cynics and Stoics, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, Epicureans. We didn't get to Philo yet, but Philo's, one of his main things was abiding by God's commandments was the way to the happy life, right? Origen was a mystic and believed in attaining Christ consciousness, as we put it, or Christ likeness. So for him, that was the ultimate. And then in varying degrees, these other philosophers, Plotinus, Philo, Origen, and Augustine, sort of, in a sense, all agreed that mystical union was the ultimate. So striving for mystical union was the way, living the mystic's life was the way to happiness. So those are a bunch of choices. I just want to see if anybody thinks any of these are right, or a combination of them is right, or if you have a completely different idea that's not even up here. Maybe we can just kind of go around the circle here. I'll stop sharing. Oh, wait, I can't leave this thing up. I'll leave it up. Okay. I can't, as I said, I can't see everybody. So what I'm going to do is see if I can at least scroll through here, see if anyone wants to jump in and take a position.
This is Lisa. I think it's really interesting that mystical union, we have Plotinus, Philo, and Origen, all are Platonists, and only Augustine is the Aristotelian.
Actually, Augustine's also a Platonist. We didn't really get into the discussion, but yeah, he's fundamentally a Platonist. He had disagreements with some of these other folks, but.
And do you know, so Augustine is representative of the mainline Catholicism, but then we have St. Bonaventure and John Duns Scotus, who are representative of the alternative orthodoxy, which is the Franciscan tradition. And I would say they're far more Platonist than Aristotelian. So yeah. I don't know that we talk about them much, St. Bonaventure and John Duns Scotus.
Well, I was going to, well, not John Duns Scotus, John Scotus Origino is a different John. Different John. I was going to get, but that's later, and I'm probably not going to get into them for this course. It's kind of, but they're you can be an Aristotelian and a mystic. Yeah, I don't know if that's what maybe I've gotten confused about what it is you're.
Maybe mine is more a comment, but that is interesting to me that Augustine would be considered, with mystical union. So that's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, he's one of the main influences on Christian mysticism as far as practices go, and of course also huge influence on the development of Catholic theology anyway. So Augustine and Aquinas later, even though they're sort of following a different philosophical path, are fundamentally in alignment on Catholic dogma, right? And on this idea of attaining mystical union, although Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, that seems to have been a sort of late in life, after he'd almost finished writing philosophy, that he sort of came to he had some kind of mystical experience according to the stories. Yeah, it's interesting that there are any Aristotelian mystics to me, but there's a lot of mysticism in the Middle Ages, although somebody like Meister Eckhart's actually more of a Platonist.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And I was getting Augustine and Aquinas mixed up, so you just cleared that all up for me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Understandable. Anybody else have comments on these possibilities? Do you like them all? Do you think there's some that aren't really that important? I should say about Philo, by the way, abiding by God's commandments, what he meant by that was his particular interpretation of the commandments. The Jewish tradition, rabbis interpret the law, and not all the interpretations are the same. So Philo's notion of what that meant might not be exactly orthodox today. So I think you, or to put it another way, when you think about unity and what we teach and how that's related to happiness, which do you see, you think any of these are sort of irrelevant? Maybe that's the way to put it. Do you rule out any of these as a component or an element of attaining happiness? Okay, well, I'll let you stew on it because we can come back to the question since I didn't get back through quite as far along as I originally intended. And that's okay, right? It's not about time, it's about truth. Truth, timeless truth. Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing then. Boom.
I have a question. This is Catherine.
Catherine? Sure.
Yeah, I just, do you have any recommended reading for us?
Well, off the top of my head, if you're sort of interested in studying the history of philosophy, my favorite book on that is Bertrand Russell's book.
Okay.
A History of Western Philosophy. There are other histories, but Bertrand Russell is very good at identifying what the philosophers were saying, what they meant, and also he'll usually provide his own sort of little critique of it. And,
Okay, sorry, I'm not really hearing the author's name.
oh, Bertrand Russell.
Russell, okay.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat stream here.